For 4 years, they counted her worth in silence and empty rooms, measuring time not by seasons, but by the absence of a child. Every whisper in the house carried the same accusation, every glance a quiet judgment she could not escape. She stood there, holding herself together while everything around her slowly turned against her, including the people who once promised to protect her. They called her Barren. They said she had failed as a wife. They said she was the reason their family name would end. But what they didn't know was that she already knew the truth, and she had known it for a long time. Her marriage was no longer a place of comfort. It had become a courtroom where she was judged daily without evidence, without mercy. Her husband, Ethan, avoided her eyes, choosing silence over confrontation, as if ignoring the problem would make it disappear. His mother, Margaret, carried her disappointment loudly, never missing a chance to remind everyone that 4 years had passed without a single pregnancy. In many American households, stories like this rarely make headlines, but they exist quietly, hidden behind closed doors where tradition, pressure, and expectation collide. And in this house, the pressure had reached a breaking point. What made this story different was not the accusation. It was the silence. Because while everyone believed they understood the situation, while they pointed fingers and planned for a future without her, she was holding on to something they had never considered. Hospital visits, quiet conversations, test results that never left her hands. She had answers that could have ended the blame overnight. But she chose not to speak. And that choice would change everything. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the truth in this story is not simple, and it is not comfortable. It raises questions that many people avoid. What happens when the person being blamed is the only one protecting everyone else? What happens when silence is not weakness, but sacrifice? And more importantly, what happens when that silence finally breaks? This is the story of Claire Whitman, a woman who carried more than just expectations on her shoulders. It is the story of a marriage tested not by love, but by pressure. And it is the story of a truth that remained hidden for 4 years, until the moment it could no longer stay buried. The story of Claire Whitman doesn't begin with answers. It begins with questions that followed her into every room, every conversation, every quiet moment she tried to claim for herself. Was she truly unable to have children, as everyone believed? Or had the truth been misunderstood from the very beginning? In many real-life cases across the United States, couples facing infertility often carry a silent burden, one that is rarely shared openly, shaped by fear, pride, and stigma. And in Claire's case, that silence became the center of everything. Because the deeper you look into her story, the more complicated it becomes. If Claire wasn't the problem, then who was? And why would the truth remain hidden for so long, especially when it had the power to stop the blame instantly? Ethan Whitman had been by her side for 4 years, yet even he seemed distant, unsure, unwilling to challenge the narrative his own mother had built. Margaret Whitman, firm in her beliefs, never questioned her assumptions. To her, the situation was simple. A marriage without children had only one explanation. But nothing about this situation was simple. Behind closed doors, conversations were happening that no one else heard. Decisions were being made quietly, carefully, almost as if someone was waiting for the right moment. Claire had been to the hospital more times than anyone knew. She had listened, processed, and accepted something that would change everything. Yet she said nothing. Not to defend herself, not to expose the truth, not even to the man she married. And that silence raises a question that changes how this story is understood. When everything finally comes to light, when the truth can no longer be hidden, who will be left standing? Will it be Claire, who carried the weight of accusation without speaking? Will it be Ethan, who chose silence when it mattered most? Or Margaret, who built her certainty on assumptions that were never questioned? Because after 4 years of silence, one hidden truth is about to surface. And when it does, everything in the Whitman household will change. Before the accusations, before the silence, before the distance that slowly settled into their marriage, Claire Whitman and Ethan Whitman had something simple and genuine. They met like many couples do, through shared routines and quiet conversations that gradually turned into something deeper. Their connection was steady, built on trust and the belief that they were choosing each other for the long run. When they stood at the altar, surrounded by friends and family, there was no sign of what would come later. Their marriage didn't start with conflict, it started with hope. In the beginning, life moved at a comfortable pace. They built routines together, planned for the future, and spoke often about the family they wanted to create. The first year passed without much concern. There was no urgency, no pressure, just the assumption that time would take care of everything. But as the second year approached, the questions began. Subtle at first, almost harmless. Casual comments during family dinners. Gentle suggestions that slowly carried more weight than intended. It was no longer just about time. It became about expectation. By the third year, the tone had changed. What once sounded like concern began to feel like blame. Margaret Whitman no longer masked her disappointment. She compared Claire to other women, mentioning neighbors, relatives, anyone who had children, as if each example was a reminder of what Claire had not given. The conversations became sharper, more direct, leaving little room for dignity. And through it all, Ethan remained caught in between, present but distant, aware of the tension, yet unwilling to confront it fully. By the fourth year, the situation had reached a point where it could no longer be contained within private conversations. The humiliation became public. Remarks were made openly, sometimes in front of guests, sometimes in moments where silence would have been more humane. Claire endured it without reaction, holding on to a composure that only made others more certain of their assumptions. To them, her silence confirmed their beliefs. To her, it was something else entirely. There were moments no one else saw. Quiet mornings where Claire sat alone, lost in thought. Afternoons spent in hospital waiting rooms, surrounded by strangers, each carrying their own version of uncertainty. She went through tests, consultations, conversations that never reached the ears of her family. Each visit brought her closer to clarity, yet further from the life she once imagined. And still, she said nothing. Ethan noticed the distance, but never asked the questions that mattered. He chose comfort over confrontation, hoping the situation would resolve itself. Margaret, on the other hand, grew more certain with each passing month, convinced that the answer had been obvious from the start. The house became divided, not by words alone, but by what was left unsaid. Then came the moment that would define everything. A quiet phone call, one that Claire answered away from everyone else. The conversation was brief, but its impact was lasting. She listened carefully, her expression unchanged, absorbing information that would have shifted the entire narrative if spoken aloud. When the call ended, she stood still for a moment, as if deciding something far more important than anyone could see. Because deep down, Claire already knew something no one else did. The tension inside the Whitman household had been building for years, but it reached a point where it could no longer be contained behind closed doors. It happened during what was meant to be a simple family gathering. One of those evenings where appearances are carefully maintained and discomfort is hidden beneath polite conversation. But that night, Margaret Whitman chose not to hide her thoughts. In front of relatives, friends, and people who barely understood the situation, she spoke with a sharpness that cut through the room. She questioned Claire openly, her words direct and unforgiving, reducing 4 years of marriage into a single accusation that left no space for dignity. Claire stood there, surrounded by eyes that quickly shifted between curiosity and discomfort. No one intervened. No one challenged Margaret. The silence in the room became just as loud as the words themselves. And while some looked away, unwilling to be part of the moment, others watched closely, as if witnessing something they had long suspected. Claire did not respond. She didn't defend herself or raise her voice. She simply stood still, absorbing the weight of a situation that had now moved beyond private judgment into public humiliation. But Margaret didn't stop there. What came next changed the tone entirely. With a calm certainty that suggested this had been planned long before that evening, she introduced the idea that had been forming in her mind. Another woman. Someone she believed would give Ethan the child she was convinced Claire could not. The suggestion was no longer subtle. It was deliberate, spoken in a way that made it clear she saw this as the only solution left. The room shifted again, this time heavier, as the implications settled in. This was no longer just criticism. It was replacement. The conversation that followed carried a tension that no one could ignore. Voices rose slightly, then fell back into uneasy quiet. Claire listened as her future was discussed, as if she were no longer part of it. And then, in a moment she wasn't meant to hear, The words that would stay with her longer than anything else were spoken quietly, almost casually. "We can't waste more time." It wasn't said with anger. It was said with finality, as if a decision had already been made. That sentence marked a shift inside her. Not outwardly, not in a way anyone could immediately see, but something changed. Later that night, when the house had settled into silence, Claire finally turned to Ethan. The question she asked was simple, but it carried the weight of everything that had happened. She looked at him, searching for something she had not seen in a long time, and asked, "Do you also think I'm the problem?" There was no interruption, no immediate answer, just silence. And in that silence, she found more clarity than any words could have given her. The next day, Claire returned to the hospital. But this time, there was a difference. Her steps were steady, her expression composed in a way that suggested she had already made peace with something. The conversations she had there were no longer filled with uncertainty. They were direct, purposeful, leading toward a decision that had been forming quietly over the years. Whatever she had been holding on to, whatever truth she had kept to herself, it was no longer just something she carried. It was something she was preparing to confront. And that night, as everything around her remained unchanged on the surface, Claire made a decision that would change everything. After that night, something shifted in a way no one in the Whitman household could fully explain. The tension was still there, the conversations still sharp, but Claire Whitman was no longer reacting the same way. To everyone else, it seemed like she had withdrawn, as if she had accepted the role they had placed on her. But beneath that quiet exterior, something else was taking shape. Because while the family continued to speak with certainty, Claire had already moved into a different phase of the story, one where answers existed, even if they had not yet been revealed. At the hospital, the conversations had become more focused. Claire sat across from the doctor, listening carefully, her expression steady as details were explained in a tone that carried both clarity and weight. Certain words stood out, words that could have ended years of accusation if spoken aloud. But the full conversation remained between them. She asked questions, not out of confusion, but out of confirmation. By the time she stood up to leave, there was no hesitation in her movements. She wasn't searching anymore. She already knew. Back at home, her behavior began to change in subtle but noticeable ways. She no longer tried to defend herself when Margaret Whitman made remarks. She didn't engage in arguments or attempt to correct assumptions. Instead, she observed. She listened more than she spoke, paying attention to conversations that had once overwhelmed her. To some, it looked like resignation. To others, it felt unsettling, as if her silence now carried intention rather than defeat. Ethan Whitman noticed the difference, but he couldn't understand it. He had grown used to distance, but this felt different. This felt deliberate. Meanwhile, the situation within the family continued to escalate. Margaret moved forward with a confidence that suggested there was no longer anything left to consider. Conversations about a second marriage became more direct, more structured, as if plans were already being set into motion. Names were mentioned, introductions hinted at, and timelines discussed without hesitation. What had once been an idea was now becoming a reality in their minds. And still, Claire said nothing to stop it. From the outside, the situation invited speculation. It would have been easy to assume Claire was hiding something else entirely. Perhaps she was pregnant and waiting for the right moment to reveal it. Perhaps she had received a diagnosis she wasn't ready to share. Or maybe she was preparing to leave quietly, choosing her exit over confrontation. Each possibility seemed plausible, each one adding another layer to a story that refused to settle into a single explanation. But none of those assumptions captured the full truth. Then came the moment that brought everything to a pause. A family meeting was called, one that carried a sense of finality even before it began. Everyone was present. The atmosphere was heavy, filled with unspoken expectations about what would be decided and who would be affected. Margaret sat with the same certainty she had carried for months. Ethan remained quiet, caught between roles he had yet to define. And then Claire entered the room. This time, there was no hesitation in her steps, no sign of uncertainty in her expression. She walked in with a calm confidence that immediately shifted the attention toward her. In her hand, she held a document. It wasn't just paper. It was something more, something that carried answers, something that had the power to rewrite everything that had been said about her over the past 4 years. And as she took her place in that room, one thing became clear. The silence she had maintained for so long was about to end. The room fell into a silence that felt heavier than anything that had been said before. Claire Whitman stood still for a moment, holding the document in her hands, looking at the people who had spent years defining her without ever asking for the truth. Then came the moment that changed everything, and the results never changed. She paused briefly, just enough for the weight of what she was about to say to settle in. I am not the problem. The words were clear, direct, and impossible to misinterpret. For a second, it seemed like no one in the room fully processed what she meant. The belief they had held on to for 4 years didn't break instantly. It resisted, as if refusing to accept what was now being placed in front of them. Claire lowered the document slightly, her eyes moving toward Ethan Whitman. The problem was never me. This time, there was no ambiguity. The meaning was unmistakable. The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer filled with judgment or expectation. It was filled with realization. The truth they had avoided, the possibility they had never considered, had been there from the beginning, waiting to be acknowledged. Ethan's composure began to crack under the weight of what had just been revealed. The quiet distance he had maintained for years gave way to something more exposed, more human. He looked at Claire, then at the document, then away again, as if trying to process a reality he had not allowed himself to face. His silence, once a form of avoidance, now carried something closer to regret. Margaret Whitman, who had spoken with certainty for so long, said nothing. The confidence that had defined her reactions was gone, replaced by a stillness that suggested she was confronting something she could not easily dismiss. In that moment, everything that had been built on assumption began to collapse, not with noise or chaos, but with a quiet shift that changed how each person in that room understood the past 4 years. Claire had not defended herself, not because she couldn't, but because she chose not to. And now, the truth she had carried alone was no longer hidden. It was out in the open, impossible to ignore and impossible to take back. The silence that followed should have been the end of it, but Claire Whitman wasn't finished. She stood there, steady and composed, as if she had been waiting not just to reveal the truth, but to finally release everything she had carried alone. Her voice, when she spoke again, was just as calm, but this time it held something deeper. I knew, she said quietly. The words didn't come with hesitation. I've known from the beginning. That statement landed differently. It wasn't just about the truth anymore. It was about time, about choices, about everything she had endured while fully aware of what was really happening. She didn't look away as she continued. I had the results years ago. There was no need to raise her voice. The weight of what she was saying filled the room on its own. I could have said something. I could have ended all of this the moment it started. For a brief second, the question lingered in the air without being asked directly. Why didn't she? Why allow the accusations, the humiliation, the distance to continue for so long? Claire answered without waiting. I stayed silent because I didn't want to destroy him. Her eyes moved toward Ethan Whitman, not with anger, but with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. I protected you, she said, and this time, the emotion beneath her control was impossible to ignore. Even when no one protected me, the room, already quiet, seemed to hold its breath. Everything shifted in that moment. The narrative that had defined her for 4 years was no longer just wrong. It was exposed as something far more complicated, something shaped by sacrifice rather than weakness. Claire had not been silent because she had nothing to say. She had been silent because she chose to carry the truth alone. Then came the final shift, the moment that redefined her place in that house. But silence has a limit. The words were firm, not harsh, but final. There was no anger in them, only resolution. For the first time, Claire wasn't responding to what had been done to her. She was deciding what would happen next. She looked around the room, at the faces that had once judged her without question, and made it clear without needing many words. The version of her they had known no longer existed. What she chose next was not driven by impulse, but by clarity. She picked up the document again, holding it not as proof anymore, but as closure. Without raising her voice or seeking validation, she stepped back from the space that had defined her struggle. Whether she walked away completely or remained on her own terms, one thing was certain. The power had shifted. The control they once held over her story was gone. And as the weight of everything settled into that room, one truth remained. Sometimes, the loudest accusations hide the deepest truths, the ones no one wants to face. the ones that take the longest to reveal themselves. So the question becomes unavoidable. If you were in Claire Whitman's position, would you have stayed silent? Now that you've heard Claire Whitman's story from beginning to end, the truth is no longer hidden, but the questions it leaves behind are just as important as the revelation itself. What do you think? Was she right to protect Ethan Whitman, even when it meant years of blame and humiliation that were never hers to carry? Or did her silence allow the situation to go too far, giving space for assumptions to grow into something far more damaging than the truth ever would have been? Moments like this don't come with easy answers. They reflect real choices people make every day, often in situations where emotions, loyalty, and fear are deeply intertwined. Claire made her decision based on what she believed was right at the time, but the outcome shows how complicated that choice truly was. So now it's your turn to weigh in. Let us know in the comments what you would have done if you were in her position. And if this story surprised you, hit the subscribe button and like. If it made you question how well we really understand the people closest to us, then there's another story you need to hear next.